Okay, here we are back again, continuing on from the previous video. And as I mentioned just at the end there, I went back and in the tiled folder, I just changed the names to tiled underscore U0 V0 and tiled underscore U1 V0. The reason why I need the U0 V0 etc. at the end is because of the way that these images are going to be read. And that's what I'm about to show you. So if I come back here to the file OneNode, which is what I was trying to load in before, and I click on the folder there, and I'll just navigate to the displacement folder, to the tiled folder, and I'm just going to click on the very first one, just U0V0. It will take it a moment to think here, and as soon as it does, then I can click open. It's a large image that has to be brought in, so it can take a little while for it to be fully read. And now I can see it there. It's that dark kind of image, and I'll press open. Now, normally this would just bring in a single image, but we want both that first and second tile to be read kind of as like one image together, so that can be stretched across both tiles. So right here, what you'll notice is there's an option called UV tiling mode, and by default it's set to off, and I'm going to turn that on. I'm going to set it to ZBrush. Now, you see here now it says 2 tiles found. It's looking for, at the end of the file names, specifically that convention that I was really specific about maintaining. It wants to see a U followed by a number, underscore V followed by a number. And it uses that to determine, to tell itself which tile does this texture belong to, where to put it in the grand scheme of things. And if it doesn't see it that way, if for instance I just kept it as it was originally, which was like U0 V0 underscore tiled is not what it's looking for. And it won't necessarily see the U0 and V0 unless it's right at the end of the file name. So that's fine. Now we also want to make sure that we keep our color space set to raw. That's the default in my case, but it might not be in your case. So you might want to make sure that that's set to raw. And you'll also want to change your filter type. We don't want these images to be filtered in any way. That basically is sort of a kind of like a blur, really, that gets applied to it. We don't need any of that, so I'm going to turn that off. We don't need to worry about anything else, though, which is really fortunate. So long as you keep these settings, you'll be fine. So if we go ahead and take a look now, now we're not really seeing what we would expect to see here. It's not really showing up, and that's for one particular reason. I'm going to go ahead and just set this to the legacy default viewport for now, and I'm going to click on the head, and I want to come into the attribute editor, so Control A on the keyboard. And once I'm in the attribute editor, I'll go to attributes, and you'll see that there's a section down here for VRay. And what these attributes do, there's something specific to VRay, and they help the rendering engine to understand the mesh better as far as the way that VRay understands it. So I'm going to turn on subdivision, the first one, and then the second one, which is subdivision and displacement quality, and then finally displacement control. Now those actually do get kicked in here right at the bottom, so go to the bottommost drop-down menu, and I'm going to make the following changes. I'm going to turn off subdivide UVs. I'm going to come down and I'll change the max subdivisions to 8, which is probably the highest number I really want to go with this. The higher the number, the better quality I get, but the longer it takes, and eventually, the higher you go, it doesn't really make much difference except for taking more time. Edge length is something that I could later on change. I can get a more accurate result if I lower this, but it takes longer. Displacement amount. Well, this is an interesting one, which we're going to talk about here in just a moment. I'll leave it at 1 for now, which is the equivalent to what the original displacement was. But we'll come back to explain how to fix that in a moment. I will turn Keep Continuity on, and I will also come down here, and I'm going to turn off Filter Texture, because again, we don't need that to be blurred in any way. And we'll just leave this as a normal displacement as well. So if you have those settings, you should be fine. And if I go in and I come back to my VRay IPR again, it's still trying to calculate my scene, and it's taking a little bit longer here now. I don't need to keep the head selected. But I still don't see any difference here. Now, the reason for this, and it took me a while to figure this out, has to do with the fact that we actually scaled up the head. And by scaling up the head, the displacement that we had created was based on a head that was the original size when we first imported it in. But as soon as we start scaling it up, the amount of impact that displacement has is only relative to the original size. Now, as a result, since I know exactly how much I scaled this up, I brought it up by a factor of 12.316. I'm going to use that same factor here to change my displacement amount to match that, 12.316. Okay, let's just let this kind of render through here. And I'm starting to see a little bit of a difference on this surface. Now, it's probably going to be easier to see it, not necessarily in the IPR view, which I don't get the absolute best results here, but I'm going to go ahead now. I'll switch this back to just a legacy view quality, and I'm going to go into my, my render view. And this is what I rendered before just as a little test. This has no displacement on it, so I'll just save that. And I will now render this hopefully with some displacement. So I'll just pause the video while it does that. Okay, so here it's just finished. Took just about 1:30, and you can see that there's definitely some high resolution detail that's going on in there. Some noise on the skin, a little bit of imperfections on the skin, and this is what we need to see. Now the defaults here on the VRay IPR are not of a high enough quality to be able to really see all that. I could probably change some of these to get a better output, but I'm not going to really worry about that for right now. However, this does tell me that my displacement is working, which is great news. And if I wanted to increase the amount of displacement, I could continue to increase this value. But before we do that, it's probably a good idea to go in and do a test of our normal map. So I'm just going to bring my hypershade back here real quick. I always like to name my file, I'll name all my textures and such. So this one is just going to be T for texture underscore displacement. And I might call it head displacement, in fact. How about this? T underscore head disp. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is bring in the normal map. So the normal map is going to get plugged into the VR face material directly. So I'm going to click on the face material, and I'm going to come down here to bump mapping. And specifically, by default, this might just say bump map. You want to change the map type to normal map in tangent space, because when we exported it out of ZBrush, we indicated that it was going to be tangent based. So the multiplier is probably 1 by default, and we'll just go in and click on map, bring that in, and again find the file node. The file node here is just pop down here. There we go. So we'll call this T underscore head underscore NM. So normal map there. I'm just going to pop back here where I typed that in as disp before. I'm going to type that in as DM just to keep it consistent. Normal map. And again, we don't want there to be any filtering. We'll turn that off. I will go ahead and grab the appropriate file, which is under the normal folder. So just click on the first one, change the tiling to ZBrush. So now it's found 2 tiles, and the color space here needs to be raw as well. Otherwise you'll get weird results, which you don't want. So now that I've done that, in order to be able to get a sense of what does the normal map look like versus just the displacement map, what we can do is just quickly come here, and I'm just going to click on the little green arrow that connects displacement shader to the shading group, and I'm just going to press delete when I do that. All that's done is it's disabled the input from the displacement shader into our rendering path here, but we can reconnect that soon after once we do this test. And so what we're going to see now is going to be just the result of the normal map. So if I come in here, let's just see what happens if I try to render this through VRay. I'm just curious to see how well it does this, if it does it at all. There we go. Yeah, again, it looks really faint. I can see it a little bit. I can see a little bit of like that imperfection there, but I really want to see it more clearly. So I'm going to go back in, and let's just go ahead and save this image here, and I'll press render now, and I'll just let it do its thing. Okay, so looking at that, we can see that we definitely have some high frequency detail going on in there. And just compare before and after. So that was just a displacement map, and this is the normal map on its own. If we combine these two together, we're going to get the full-on result that we want. In fact, as you notice here in the displacement map, there is some information that's not really being displayed there, whereas in the normal map we get some more information on the neck. Now this is at a really low quality render. It's not very large at all. And so we would see some of this detail better if we were rendering a bigger image, and you could, if you wanted to. You could bring it up to like 1600 by 1600, which is usually where I would probably render this at. But let's go ahead now and combine our bump map and our normal map together. Sorry, our normal map and our displacement map together. One of the things that in my investigations I found worked well for me was if I want to increase the intensity, the effect of the normal map, going back onto the face material here, I'll just change this to a higher value, and I just found that for me, just setting that to 2 actually worked a little bit better. I got more intensity out of that normal map. And I'm going to reconnect now my displacement map to my shading group. So I will click on the little white dot here, and I'll choose displacement, and it starts to create a little line that gets dragged out. And I'm going to just click next to displacement shader here. It kind of snaps into that, and that reconnects it there. So now when I go to render this again, it will have both the displacement and the normal map being applied. Now I've done this already, so I kind of know what to expect. But what I'm going to do is go in and just create the right render settings for myself. So let me go in and I'll close that there. My render view is over here. So I'll go and click on the render settings. So I'll come back to common. And I'm going to change the size of this image to 1600 by 1600. And if you find that you're rendering through something that looks a little bit different than the normal render view, you might be rendering through the VRay frame buffer, in which case you could turn that on or off. If you turn it off, you just end up rendering through the normal Maya render view. Okay, so it's going to render the render cam, and the VRay options here. When we're doing our initial tests, it's probably better to actually have the max subdivs down to something like 8. I have it up here at 24 to start with. Well, when I started this, and so you could if you have it at a lower value for the final render, you could raise it up a little bit. The sampler type, bucket is fine. Anti-aliasing type Gaussian is fine. And that's just going to improve the overall quality of the render. So we can just keep those settings, and that should be fine. And now let's go ahead and actually render this out and see what we get. So click render there. Okay, so here we are, all finished. It took about 7 minutes. And if I go ahead and take a look at this at full size, you can see that we got lots of great detail in there. This basically matches the kind of detail that we saw in originally in ZBrush, and it's always a good idea to take a good look around your image, make sure that it's all working the way you expect it to. And you might think that this actually looks a bit rough, and honestly, if based on the way that we normally look at skin, it would. But this is a material that doesn't have the same kind of effect of normal skin where light gets to penetrate into the skin and bounce around and create a slightly translucent, light responsive surface. It just, in this case, the light is just bouncing off. It's more like it's stone, and therefore the little indentations look deeper than the way that they would feel if we had the same depth of indentation on a skin material. So usually we have to kind of push the depth of these indentations a little bit further than we might feel comfortable with, so that when we go ahead and apply this to the skin material, it looks right. And that's okay. So in this case, we can definitely see all the details. It looks really nice. And we could say at that point that we've managed to bring in bring in our displacement maps, our normal maps, and that they all work. All right, and with that, we could probably finish off here. This is just a test material. It's just a way to get started, and it's just a way to make sure everything's working correctly. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and we'll see you again in the next lesson.